let's get into Fareed Zakaria, CNN propagandist. One of my least favorite pretends to be one of the good ones, one of the smart ones, but he's not. He's just a somewhat high-level propagandist, or not even really high level. All he's doing is nitpicking data and nitpicking news stories globally to try and push the CNN narrative, to try and push the neoliberal narrative, whatever narrative is coming down from the neocon-run Democratic Party, or neolib-run Democratic Party is what Fareed Zakaria is going to push. He's just going to try and make it sound intellectual. But he's not to be trusted. Not to be trusted. The first time he was doing the funniest Fareed Zakaria moment was when Trump was president, and just every day it was anti-Trump coverage. Trump is evil. Trump is a disgrace. Trump has no civility. Trump has no decorum. What a disgrace to our country. Trump took power undemocratically, blah, 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 blah. And then Trump launched missiles at Syria. He launched missile strikes at Bashar al-Assad under the sketchy claims of gas attacks that have since been disproven. That Assad was, or it's been proven Assad was not, or there's no proof that Assad was using chemical gas on his people, which were the justification for these attacks. And Fareed Zakaria does a segment, his very first segment, praising Trump and saying this was the moment where Trump became president, which was a hilarious line. Like, yeah, he wasn't a U.S. president before, but then he launches missiles into Syria, a country that's never attacked us based on lies, and now he's a U.S. president. Now he's officially in the club. Yeah, I see how it works, Fareed. But this guy pretends to be an intellectual, pretends to be a lefty, right? But all he wants is more war. He's nothing but a fancy talking puppet for the military-industrial complex.
In his important book, The Third Wave, Samuel Huntington pointed out that division among the ruling elite is a key sign of weakness in authoritarian regimes. When prominent members of the establishment break with the system, it often triggers a larger set of changes. Conversely, when you do not see such defections, it means the autocrat will probably be able to survive.
They never define these terms either. The U.S.'s enemies are authoritarian regimes. We're liberal democracies. Forget the fact that our country censors anybody critical of the State Department or of the Pentagon, or that they just got caught, the intelligence agencies just got caught controlling Twitter and controlling TikTok in order to push out any kind of critical narrative. We're not autocratic. We're not an authoritarian regime. It's only censorship when Russia does it, or when Bashar al-Assad does it.
Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad offers one example.
Hey, right on cue.
Example of this principle at work. So how would we apply that to Russia today? Yevgeny Prigozhin's failed attack has revealed some dissent within Russia's ruling elite, but Vladimir Putin was apparently able to snuff it out within a day or two. It appears that Prigozhin got no public support from any key figure in the Kremlin, which could be why he ended his quixotic march on Moscow. Putin has spent much of his tenure crushing dissent from liberals. Now he is subduing his challengers.
It was never an attack, though. That's the thing. It wasn't an attack. They were going to go to the Kremlin to have words with Putin, or some people believe Prigozhin was going to try and overthrow the government violently, but, there was never any bloodshed. So, and he turned, Lukashenko brokered a peace deal or whatever, got him to turn around right away before anybody was killed. So it wasn't even an attack. And Yevgeny Prigozhin is not part of the Russian government. He's not part of the Kremlin. He's the leader of the Wagner Professional Mercenary Company. So he's a military leader of a group who tried to make some sort of political power grab when he felt like his back was against the wall. And it was stifled very quickly.
Sent from liberals. Now he's subduing his challengers on the national.
But and that alone doesn't make Russia an autocratic or authoritarian regime, right? Prigozhin, I mean, they pointed this out on the Duran, which is one of my favorite news shows, with Alexander Mercouris and Alex Christoforou. For weeks, they were saying that Prigozhin is being extremely critical of the Russian Ministry of Defense. He's being extremely critical of Russian higher-ups and military officers in a way that no military in the world would accept. Right? Any military, whether in the U.S., UK, France, an African country, Latin American country, whatever, They wouldn't allow somebody to be saying the things that Prigozhin was saying about his military officers without punishment, just openly criticizing the Russian Ministry of Defense. And like I said, Prigozhin is the leader of this mercenary group, working together with the Russian military. So there was going to be a conflict that came to a head at some point, right? There was going to be some kind of military discipline on Prigozhin. So he felt like his back was against the wall, and he made a move against Moscow. He made a move against Putin. But that doesn't mean that Russia's an authoritarian, autocratic regime that Putin, is ruling over with an iron fist. Prigozhin was just isolated politically and felt like his back was against the wall, which is why he lashed out in this way and did this.
Nationalist side.
But the CNN narrative has to be so simplistic. Putin's a comic book villain. Prigozhin tried to fight back for the Russian people, but he was smashed by the autocratic Russian regime. The democratic Biden regime would have let the military just march into Washington, D.C. and seize the White House.
Power struggles within the Russian state take place in a black box. As the lines often attributed to Winston Churchill go, Kremlin political intrigues are comparable to a bulldog fight under a rug. An outsider only hears the growling, and when he sees the bones fly out from beneath, it's obvious who won. For now, it is Prigozhin's bones that we see figuratively, and perhaps soon we shall see them literally.
I don't think that's the worst description of how Russia makes internal political decisions, even in the time Churchill was alive, in the time of the Soviet Union, right? They're not just doing things with an open door policy and complete transparency. But of course, the U.S. doesn't either. And of course, they keep us fighting. The news keeps us fighting about things that don't matter, about culture war issues, social issues, hot button topics like that, while they make all the foreign policy decisions in backdoor meetings, right? They make all the important decisions in terms of governance and foreign policy and things like that in private, and then try and lie to give justification for whatever it is they're doing.
What is not a matter of speculation is the state of Russian society. I've been stunned by one statistic ever since I read it. A 15-year-old Russian male today has the same life expectancy as a 15-year-old male in Haiti. Remember, Russia is one of the world's richest countries in terms of natural resources, and it is an urbanized, industrialized society with...
Not really, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this is what Fareed's going to do. He's going to point out how Russia's got high poverty statistics to try and make them seem like a failing autocratic regime or whatever, when we know that the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed Russia's economy to be plundered by Western multinationals, underwent a process of deindustrialization that was an absolute human rights and economic disaster. Thousands and thousands of people died from malnutrition. Unemployment shot through the roof, drug abuse shot through the roof, and drugs flowed over the border for the first time in years, as did prostitution. And the country was plundered by Western multinationals. They went from this industrial powerhouse to a somewhat, semi-deindustrialized nation in a deep, deep, deep economic crisis. And why Putin has so much popularity is because he said we're going to have a pro-Russian economy. Right, we're going to enact nationalistic, pro-Russian economic policies. We still have oligarchs, but we're going to force the oligarchs to invest in Russia, particularly, and this will relate to something Fareed says later, particularly in Russian energy, right? Oil, natural gas. If we can control our raw materials, if we can control our energy supply, we can control our economy and become much more prosperous and become much richer, kind of taking a page out of China's book or the Soviet Union's book, with more central economic planning designed to boost and strengthen the Russian economy. So that's made Putin very popular, but the poverty and deindustrialization Fareed's talking about happened because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Western finance capitalists who plundered Russia's economy. Also, thanks so much, Battle Cossack, for another super chat. And agree, the coup attempt had the opposite effect. It made Putin and Lukashenko more popular, as have the pro-working class, pro-Russian or Belarusian economic reforms that I was just talking about.
levels of education and literacy comparable to and perhaps even exceeding European countries.
They were also extremely high. Literacy and education rates, collapse of the Soviet Union, tanked. But socialism doesn't work, right? Capitalism's the only system that works, right? Unless you look at all of the relevant statistics.
This analysis comes from an August 2022 working paper by the scholar Nicholas Eberstein.
From the American Enterprise Institute. That is the best name for a pro-corporate, pro-Western finance capital think tank or NGO I've ever heard of.
Who has long studied demography. He points out that for 3 decades now, Russia has been depopulating. With a brief respite from 2013 to 15.
For 3 decades! They're basically saying the quiet part out loud. What happened in 1991, Fareed? Why aren't you talking about what happened there? Why aren't you talking about the fact that the socialist economic system and government collapsed and their economy was taken over by Western capitalists? Why aren't you explaining that, Fareed? Seems like kind of a relevant part of the data points you're breaking down here. Are you just cherry picking?
Deaths have outpaced births. But he notes that this trend is one that we see in many industrialized countries. What stands out in Russia is its mortality rate. Using the World Health Organization's data in 2019, before any effects from COVID or the war, the World Health Organization estimated a 15-year-old boy in Russia could expect to live another 53.7 years, which is about the same as a Haitian and below the life expectancy.
Fareed's take, the stunning decay of Russian society, all because of Putin, all because of this oligarch. It's so stupid. It's so stupid. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to this economic decay. Everybody in Russia knows that. That's why the Soviet Union is, or 70% of Russians say they wish the Soviet Union never fell now. And why there's such a positive view of Stalin in Russia now. And Putin came in and said, you know, I'm not a socialist, I'm not a Marxist, I'm not a communist, but we need to enact nationalistic Russian or pro-Russian economic policies, like I said, and try and rebuild Russia. And that's what they've started to do, which is why the West is now making it a priority to destroy Russia, right? But Fareed's just trying to say Russia's economy is decaying because authoritarianism or something. It's the most simple-minded, stupid, disconnected from reality take or analysis. It's just pure propaganda.
For males in Yemen, Mali, South Sudan, European males of around the same age could expect to live about 7 years longer than Russians. Education usually correlates with good health, but not in Russia. Eberstadt points out that shockingly, Russia is a country with first world educational levels and fourth world mortality rates for its working age population. He then digs deeper into the educational attainments and finds that the mystery deepens. With huge numbers of well-trained people, especially in the sciences, Russia performs miserably in the knowledge economy.
All right, Russia performs miserably in the knowledge economy, he says. Now, I want you to pay attention to what he means by that and the data points that he uses to try and show that Russia is performing poorly economically. Like I said, Putin has been heavily investing in Russian energy, trying to build up Russian natural gas, Russian oil, things like that. Because if you control the energy source, you can, help your economy flourish and control really the base of your economy, because all economic activity is driven by energy. And how do we know that the U.S. cares about this? Because they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, which is how Russia trades energy with Europe, right? So they're concerned about this sort of socialistic control that Russia's taking over their energy sector to try and reindustrialize and rebuild their economy, making them a world superpower in terms of economics and politics again. But Fareed saying, no, they're just decaying. They've been decaying for 30 years. There's no Putin rebuilding Russia. There's no reinvestment in Russia brought about by Putin. Look at how poorly they're performing in the knowledge economy.
Much worse than did the Soviet Union. In 2019, Russia ranked behind Austria in international patent applications.
Because they don't have as many international patents. They don't use intellectual property laws the same way that Western finance capitalists do, who only founded the World Trade Organization so they could enforce patent laws all around the globe and use them to gain a competitive advantage like they did during COVID. They used intellectual property laws. They used patents to stop other countries from either importing or making the vaccine themselves. They said, no, we own the recipe to this vaccine. We know it's a global pandemic. You can't have it, though. We need to make money. And that was enforced by the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization, which were institutions created and that have always been propped up by Western finance capital so they can use patents to gain an advantage in the market. But because Russia doesn't have as many of these, we're supposed to assume that they're just not producing anything, that their economy is tanking and decaying because they don't have as many patents as us. When the monopoly on patents has been, or when Western finance capitalists purposefully maintain a monopoly on patents to gain a competitive advantage over countries like Russia. But Fareed doesn't even mention that.
Despite having 16 times the population. Today, it ranks alongside Alabama in U.S. patents, the gold standard for companies everywhere.
The U.S. patent is the gold standard for companies everywhere. And like I said, they purposefully maintain a monopoly on those patents. And what he's basically admitting here is that the global patent system is controlled by the U.S. It's controlled by the Western finance capitalists, and they utilize those patents nefariously to, like I said, stop competitors or competitive countries from producing their own stuff. And the World Trade Organization and these global organizations were created to enforce these intellectual property laws globally and outsource U.S. patent laws to the rest of the world, so we prevent the rest of the world from developing, and we can hog all of the intellectual property and all of the knowledge and the information for making things like vaccines, right? But that's Russia's fault. That's not Western finance capitalists purposefully weaponizing and monopolizing patents to make more profit and outcompete other countries. It's because Russia's decaying. If they had more, if they had a monopoly on medical patents and patents for insulin and medicine, the way U.S. pharmaceutical companies have, then they'd have a good economy, an economy that takes care of their people. Like, no, these patents aren't even good for us. These patents screw us over. Pharmaceutical companies use patents every single day and buy up as many patents as they can to stop cheaper alternative drugs from being made that would save people's lives, because they only want to push expensive drugs that will make them a lot of profit in the market.
The gold standard.
But patents, the more patents you have, the better your economy's doing, says the fucking genius Fareed Zakaria. And this is why he gets paid the big bucks by CNN, baby, for genius graphs like this.
For companies everywhere, despite having almost 30 times the population of Alabama. All these numbers will likely get much worse, given the hundreds of thousands of likely well-trained, urban, educated Russians who fled the country after its aggression against Ukraine. What explains this stunning mismatch in Russia? A new book by the scholar Alexander Etkind, Russia Against Modernity, makes the case that Putin has created a parasitic state that gets revenues by extracting natural resources rather than any creative production.
Putin has created a parasitic state that creates wealth by extracting natural resources, not any kind of creative intellectual production. So do you get what he's doing there? As I said, Russia is reindustrializing. They're investing in their real economy, their energy sector, their real productive economy, their extractive industries. Whereas the U.S. is dominated by pharmaceutical companies and companies using intellectual patent and technology companies. And you know what Fareed here is calling the knowledge-based economy. So he's saying that because Russia doesn't have as many pharmaceutical patents as us or whatever, that they're not producing anything creative the same way that Pfizer and the pharmaceutical companies in the West are. They're just investing in extracting natural resources. What a bunch of idiots. What a bunch of backwards idiots. Don't they know you can run an entire economy just with pharmaceutical companies and medicine? Why are they extracting things out of the ground? Idiot Russians. Like, this is so stupid. This is so stupid. He's saying that because Russia doesn't have the obsession with fictitious capital, knowledge economy capital, like we do, and they don't have the obsession with buying up patents so that you can use them to gain a competitive advantage that Western pharmaceutical companies have, that they have a crumbling and decaying economy. And he has the nerve or the stupidity to say, and they're investing in natural resource extraction, not producing anything creative. Natural resource extraction is the base of any economy. How do you have trade and exchange without natural resources? Right? How do you create medicine? How do you create pharmaceutical products without natural resources? How do you create computers that are used to create technology and all the Silicon Valley capital, the way that the Silicon Valley oligarchs make their profit? Yeah, a lot of it's online, a lot of it's digital, but natural resources are still the base of that. And that's what Russia's investing in. That's what China's been investing in. Read Michael Hudson's essay, China's Industrial Socialism versus Western Financialization, which is the state that our economy is in, which is actually the economy in decay, not Russia and China's. But yeah, the fact that we control all the patents and the knowledge economy doesn't mean that Russia's economy is decaying and ours is thriving. In fact, it's quite the opposite, Fareed. You've literally managed to get to the exact opposite of what your conclusion should be. That Russia and China are building by investing in industry, investing in natural resource extraction, and our society is crumbling because we're run by a bunch of pharmaceutical companies, landlords, and bankers, and Silicon Valley people like Mark Zuckerberg,
and which fulfills
who are having a crisis of profit and aren't able to bring in enough profit anymore. So they're finding all these ways to nickel and dime us and lay off workers and drive their wages down. Whereas in Russia, they're adding jobs, they're investing in their industry, and putting people back to work in those industries.
none of the functions of a modern state in terms of providing welfare for its people. Corruption is intrinsic to this kleptocratic regime, Atkins says, noting that post-Soviet Russia has seen the fastest rise in inequality anywhere in the world. After the protests against him in 2011 and 2012, which an enraged Putin blamed on then...
He just conflates what happened at the fall of the Soviet Union with Putin. Right? When exactly did Putin come to power? He says there was an economic collapse after the fall of the Soviet Union, and then goes right into something about Putin. Putin was inaugurated in 2000. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the economy was being plundered even a little bit before that. So the human rights disaster, the deindustrialization and destruction of the Russian economy happened 10 years before Putin took power. Right? And Putin was able to take power, and he has so much popularity because he's pursued a more nationalistic economic policy, a more populist economic policy, not just total deregulation and liberalization, handing over Russia's economy to Western multinationals. But he conflates the fall of the USSR with the rise of Putin. It's all the same thing. You know, there's no progression over those 30 years. Everything that happened in 1991 should be laid at the feet of Vladimir Putin, according to Fareed Zakaria.
Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the Russian state became even more anti-modern. You see, for Putin's regime, the West now represents forces of social, economic, and political modernization that could infect Russia. In his speech as he launched the war in Ukraine...
No, they represent financialization and imperialism. And, you know, there are a lot of cultural values and political values that we have in the West who Russia also sees themselves as being opposed to, right? But they don't see us as like a modern civilized economy, and they're a backwards economy, and that's why they want to destroy us, right? They just want to keep industrializing, keep building themselves up, and trading with China, trading with Iran, trading with Venezuela, doing what they're doing. And the U.S. keeps trying to stop it. The U.S. keeps doing things like blowing up Nord Stream, sabotaging Russia's energy investment, expanding NATO right up to their borders, trying to install a puppet regime in Kiev that they can use to launch attacks into Russia through Ukraine.
Putin accused...
It's really the U.S. who sees Russia as an advancing, as a modernizing, as a civilized, or as an advancing civilization. And that's why we want to destroy it. We want to undercut it at the root. We want to stop Russia's economic advancement, their advancement in production. And they're desperate to do it. And this is why at the 2017 summit that NATO had, they said Russia and China are their number one enemies and targets going forward. I had something else I wanted to say, but oh yeah, and it's the imperialists always project, right? They always end up in this place of projection, like where Fareed Zakaria is at. Like Russia's attacking us because they view us as a modernizing society, an advancing society economically and politically, and they're just so backwards. When it's the opposite, it's the US attacking Russia because they're advancing economically. And look at who's got troops where. Russia doesn't have troops in Canada. Russia doesn't have troops in Mexico. Russia's not expanding a military alliance up to the US's border so they can place a bunch of bases on the border. The US is doing that to Russia. The U.S. has expanded NATO closer to their borders every year since the 1990s, even though they promised not to, even though they said that NATO was only to contain the Soviet Union, but then kept expanding it after the Soviet Union collapsed and destroyed Yugoslavia to do so, where in Kosovo, there are now more NATO troops stationed than any other place on earth. It's basically a NATO base of a country. It's not even really a real country, but I hope I'm allowed to say that. I hope that doesn't get me banned. But it's NATO who's been expanding up to Russia's borders and trying to destroy Russia's civilization, not the other way around.
The United States are seeking to destroy Russia's traditional values and impose new ones on it, which, quote, directly lead to degradation and degeneration because they are contrary to human nature. For Putin, modernizing Russia would create a more active civil society with greater demands for better healthcare, more opportunities for ordinary citizens, and a less kleptocratic state. And so he advocates a traditional Russia, which celebrates religion, traditional morality, xenophobia, and strict gender conformity, of course. What does this all add up to?
Woke imperialism. How dare he? How dare they have different gender and cultural values than us? I sure want to invade them for the sake of the LGBTQ community, just like we supported extremist terrorists and armed extremist jihadi terrorists in Syria and Libya for gender rights, for cultural rights, because that's what jihadi terrorists stand for.
I am not sure, but it is fair to say that Russia's biggest problem is not that it is losing the Ukraine war, but rather that it is losing the 21st century.
Such projection. That's literally what the U.S. is worried about.
Tonight, and
they're worried about Russia and China winning the 21st century, which they are. They're on that track right now if we allow their economies to continue expanding at this rate, and if we allow them to continue growing as political superpowers. So the U.S. is lashing out, increasing sanctions on China, surrounding the South China Sea with our Navy, trying to get Australia to cut off trade with China and launch attacks into China, even though 50% of their trade goes to China. And they're trying to get Europe to do the same to Russia, even though about 50% of at least Germany's energy was coming from Russia before the special military operation happened. They're asking their allies to pull out all the stops and give everything they can in terms of military and political support to destroying Russia and China, because they see them as rising economic and political powers in the 21st century. They see this rising tide of what we're calling multipolarity, where Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, Russia, China, Syria, all these countries, Brazil, Lula's Brazil is also in the Belt and Road Initiative, are coming together to trade, develop each other, and build themselves up, build up industrially, economically, politically. And the U.S. is lashing out because they've been the top dog since the end of World War II. And they want to maintain that spot. They want to maintain imperialist, capitalist hegemony. And that's becoming harder and harder and harder because of the growth of Russia and China. So we want to destroy them so we can continue to rule the 21st century. We've ruled for the last 70, 80 years. We want to rule for the next 100. And Russia and China are threatening that. So the U.S. military, the U.S. empire is lashing out as it decays and collapses from within. As the popularity of socialism and communism grow from within, because the economic conditions are deteriorating and getting so bad for the working masses in these countries. But then Fareed Zakaria is going to get on CNN and say, no, Russia's the one who's decaying. They're the ones who are collapsing, and they want to destroy us because we're so good. Oh, yeah, well, why doesn't Russia have military bases in Mexico then, Fareed? Why are we training NATO troops in Ukraine, but there are no Russian troops training in Canada? Because we're the empire, and we're the ones attacking them for their economic development. You fool. You puppet.